Join me as I dive into the drama and try to figure out if Chris Rock really loses it when Karoline Leavitt fires back at those Melania marriage claims. Chris Rock is a comedian known for his outspoken views. Karoline Leavitt is a politician who's been making waves with her comments, and Melania Trump is the former First Lady of the United States. So when these three get mixed up in a controversy, it's bound to get attention. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The studio lights bathed the stage in a cool glow as the audience buzzed with anticipation. Cameras rolled, capturing every moment as the night's energy began to swell. Then, with the swagger of a man who's spent decades owning the spotlight, Chris Rock stepped onto the set. Dressed in a black leather jacket and gripping the mic like a weapon, he grinned wide, already tasting the audience's reaction. He wasted no time. With a sly tilt of his head, he launched into the joke that had set the country ablaze. "Melania doesn't live in the White House," he said. "She's locked in there, praying for a hurricane to sweep Donald away like one of his bankrupt casinos." The crowd erupted. Laughter echoed, applause rang out, and whistles cut through the air like punctuation marks on a punchline. Chris paced the stage like a preacher delivering gospel, throwing comedic grenades with every line. "Melania," he continued, "wasn't the First Lady. She was a model, trapped in a contract even the worst lawyer wouldn't sign. Every night, she stared in the mirror, repeating 'I'm fine' in 5 languages, hoping the next natural disaster would give her an exit." The audience was eating it up. Samantha, the host, leaned in with the smile of someone barely holding the reins. She asked him what he meant by the swept-away line. Chris laughed harder. He said Melania stood next to Trump, like a woman wondering how she'd ended up with a man who once stared into an eclipse without blinking. He pointed out that Trump ran the country like a canceled episode of The Apprentice with 0 ratings. And Melania? She was the only contestant who couldn't vote him off. He tossed out statistics, like comedy grenades, claiming she appeared with Trump fewer than 200 times during his term, less than the number of tweets he'd sent from the White House. Laughter built again, bigger this time. The crowd howled, some stood, and for a moment, Chris Rock owned the room. But then it happened, a subtle shift in the energy. Stage right stirred. From the wings emerged Karoline Leavitt. She didn't smile, she didn't wave. Clad in a tailored navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back like she was heading into a briefing, not a brawl. Her gaze was cold, unwavering, and as she walked to her seat, the crowd quieted, not out of politeness, but because they could feel the air thickening. Chris cracked a line, trying to break the tension, called her Trump's rescue squad, joked about Secret Service and prenups, but this time, the laughter was softer, thinner, and she still hadn't said a word. She sat down across from him, ice in her posture, fire in her eyes. Chris didn't know it yet, but the game had just changed. The silence between them was electric. Chris leaned back in his chair, still grinning, still riding the momentum from the crowd. He thought the audience was his. He thought the game was his. But Karoline Leavitt sat still, unfazed, as if she'd just walked into a negotiation, not a showdown. Her fingers tapped lightly on the desk, not nervously, but rhythmically, like a ticking clock counting down to detonation. Samantha, sensing the tension crackling between them, turned to Levit. The question was simple. What did she think? And still, Karoline said nothing. Chris took that silence as an opening. Mistake. He dove back in, mocking her salary, mocking her role. Said she was Trump's mouthpiece, paid to polish a broken image. Said Melania looked at Trump the same way he looked at his tax bill, like a man begging for escape. The audience chuckled, but it wasn't the same thunderous laughter from before. The tide was turning, and Chris didn't see it. He got louder. Bolder. Said Melania probably screamed inside every time Trump stared at the sun. Said this was the worst deal she'd ever made. Even worse than Trump's deal with America. He threw out another stat. Said Melania had smiled in public 12 times during Trump's term. He said he'd counted them on Google. Like that somehow gave him the moral high ground. He stood up again, pointed a finger straight at Levit. Claimed she could say whatever she wanted. But the truth was clear. Melania was a luxury prisoner, and Trump was the self-appointed warden with the worst wig on the planet. He sat down triumphantly, arms wide, like he'd just dropped a mic, except the mic was still in his hand. Samantha tried to smooth things over, offering a nervous laugh. She called it next-level commentary. Chris nodded proudly, thinking he'd sealed the deal. But then Karoline moved. She stood up, not quickly, not dramatically, slowly, deliberately, like a storm gathering in still air. Her voice cut through the room, not loud, but sharp, slicing through the laughter like glass. "Chris," she said, "you done?" The audience froze. The energy dropped, not from boredom, from anticipation. Chris opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't let him. "Don't call me kid," she said. "I'm the White House press secretary. I don't play comedy games, and I don't run cover for clowns." She turned to the audience, and her voice took on weight. "You've heard the jokes, now here's the truth." And just like that, she started listing the facts. 50 charity events, 30 heads of state, 15 international trips. That wasn't a prisoner, she said. That was a first lady doing her job with dignity, while people like Chris turned her life into a punchline. The room shifted. The murmurs grew. Applause began, tentative at first, then swelling. Chris tried to interrupt, called it impressive, tried to steer things back toward his comfort zone, looks, laughter, facial expressions. He asked how many times Melania looked like she wanted to run, but Karoline didn't blink. She stepped closer. Her voice, still calm, got colder. She said Melania had stood by her husband through every storm. Campaign trails, crises, cameras. She asked Chris what he knew about loyalty, about standing beside someone when the world threw fire. She paused just long enough, then hit him again. "What have you ever stood by, Chris?" she asked. "A microphone? A crowd? A paycheck?" The audience gasped. Chris tried again, called her a rescue squad, mocked her with stats, tried to tear down the numbers like they were stage props, not reality. But she wasn't backing off. She said she wasn't here to defend for claps or ratings. She was here to correct the record. Said Chris had nothing but stale jokes and shouted nonsense. Called his act cowardice dressed as comedy. And now the crowd was hers. Applause thundered. Cheers rose. People began shifting in their seats, not away from Levit, but toward her. Toward the truth she'd just delivered like a knockout punch. Chris stood, trembling, trying to reassert himself. He called her a kid again. Bad move. Karoline turned to him one last time, her voice like steel drawn across marble. "Don't ever call me kid again." She reminded him she was born for this. Reminded the audience that while Chris clung to old specials and shaky jokes, she dealt in numbers, in policy, in press briefings, in truth. She pulled out stats on the economy, talked about 3% GDP growth, record low unemployment. She turned his mockery into metrics. Every punchline he delivered, she countered with a fact, a record, a result, and the audience followed. She didn't shout, she didn't pace, she didn't even raise her voice, but somehow she was louder than he'd ever been. And Chris? He wasn't laughing anymore. The temperature in the room had changed. Chris Rock could feel it. He just couldn't admit it. He was standing center stage, arms outstretched like a preacher without a pulpit, trying to summon back the audience that once roared for him. But the laughs were thinner now. The claps scattered. He was a man still trying to win a war that had already turned against him. And Karoline Leavitt? She hadn't moved. She stood like a monument, composed, unwavering, still commanding the air with nothing more than her presence. Her silence was louder than his shouts. Chris scoffed, tried to shrug it off, but the desperation bled through. He raised his voice, stretched his arms wide, and spun to the audience. "You all see it, right?" he cried. "I don't need numbers. I've got eyes." A few chuckles, mostly silence. He said Melania looked like a woman trapped in a golden cage. Claimed her every public appearance was a silent scream. Said her expressions told a story of someone begging for escape. No facts, no proof, just a feeling he insisted was universal. But the room didn't move. Levit did. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, her words like a scalpel, calm, sharp, and aimed right at the heart of everything Chris had just thrown. "You've got eyes," she said, "but you don't have truth." The words hit hard. And then harder still. "You say she's stuck," she continued. "I see a woman who chose to stay, who faced relentless public pressure and never walked away." She turned to him, her tone steady, her expression unreadable. "What have you stayed for, Chris? Who have you stood by? You stand next to a microphone and a paycheck, and that's as far as your loyalty goes." Gasps rolled across the audience. The applause that followed was louder now, more confident, like the crowd had chosen a side. Chris flinched. He fired back, voice cracking, heat in his eyes. "You dare call me a kid?" he shouted. "I'm Chris Rock. I've got 3 Emmys, 2 Grammys, millions watching me every year. And you're just some 27-year-old with a job title and a clipboard." He pointed straight at her, but his hand shook. "You think you beat me with numbers?" he barked. "I don't care about your numbers. I say what people feel, and they laugh because I'm right." But they weren't laughing now. Karoline smiled for the first time, not out of joy, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows the scoreboard, even if the opponent won't look up. "They laugh," she said, "because you're a clown." The words dropped like lead. "I don't need Emmys," she continued. "I've got truth, and tonight, the truth's winning." Chris tried to regain footing, tried to talk over her, but it didn't matter. Karoline was cutting through him now with calm, devastating precision. "You mock Melania," she said, "while she spent 2 decades beside a man you can't stand for 10 minutes. You say she's fake. I say she's strong." Chris tried to interrupt, something about writing divorce papers during the eclipse, but it didn't land, not this time, and Karoline didn't give him space. "You bet," she said, her voice lower, colder. "I bet you've got nothing. No facts, no respect, no reality beyond your spotlight." The audience roared, for her. Chris slammed his mic on the table again. The echo rang hollow, like a man trying to make noise because his words weren't landing anymore. "I speak the truth," he yelled. "I say what people think. Melania wants out and we all see it," but it didn't matter how loud he got. Karoline had already won the room. She stepped forward again. No theatrics, just presence. "You scream," she said, "but screaming doesn't make your lies true." Then, one final blow. "Call me a kid one more time. And I'll remind you again, I'm the one standing between the president's family and people like you. You throw punches, I protect truth. And tonight, the truth just flattened you." The applause was thunderous. The crowd was on their feet. Chris Rock stood there, face flushed, breath heavy, gripping the mic like it might slip through his fingers. He tried to smirk, but it faltered. Tried to clap back, but the moment had passed. Samantha, the host, raised her hand, voice trembling but professional. She tried to reset the show, tried to cool the fire, but the fire was already out. Chris had lost. And Karoline? She hadn't even broken a sweat. The stage lights dimmed, but the heat didn't fade. Chris Rock sat in the green room, pacing like a caged animal, his breath sharp, his eyes wide. The walls couldn't hold his frustration. The laughter that once echoed for him had turned into a memory, and that crowd, his crowd, had been stolen from under him. He hurled his mic onto the table, the metal clattering against the wood. His voice cracked as he yelled, half to himself, half to his manager, Tony. "She thinks she humiliated me? I'm Chris Rock? She's a 27-year-old intern with a title. I've been selling out arenas since before she could spell politics." Tony stood by the door, calm, experienced, holding his phone like it was a detonator. He didn't flinch. He'd seen Chris angry before, but not like this. This wasn't the fury of a show gone wrong. This was the panic of a man who'd just watched his crown slip. "Chris," Tony said softly. "She played it smart. She came with numbers, stats, composure. You yelled. She didn't." Chris spun around, eyes blazing. "Exactly. That's why I need to hit back, call the PR team, get me live, tonight." Tony hesitated. "Maybe give it a night to." "No." Chris cut him off, voice shaking. "She called me a clown. I'm not letting that stand. I'm going live tonight." Tony nodded slowly and backed out the door. He didn't argue, but even he knew the damage was done. Meanwhile, across town, Karoline Leavitt was calm. She stood in a small press prep room, flanked by her team. No anger, no panic, just the quiet focus of someone who knew the storm had passed, and she'd walked out untouched. Her media assistant, a young woman with a neat ponytail and an open laptop, glanced up from her screen. "He's planning a live stream. Probably tonight. You want us to prep a response?" Karoline smiled. Not a cocky grin, a warrior's nod. "Let him, he'll only make it worse." She sat, adjusted her blazer, and leaned over the table. "Draft the statement now. Something clean. Keep it focused. White House press secretary defends truth against comedic slander. Don't mention him by name. Don't get personal. Let him be the noise. We'll be the signal." The assistant nodded and got to work, fingers flying across the keyboard. Karoline leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning headlines already rolling in across the ticker feeds. It was beginning. The news cycle ignited within minutes. CNN ran a breaking headline: Chris Rock clashes with White House press secretary, Rock rattled, Levitt unshaken. Clips of the exchange went viral, one in particular: Chris tossing his mic and Karoline, cool as ice, cutting him off mid-rant. Anchors debated the fallout with wide eyes and animated gestures. He tried to roast the Trump family, one commentator said, and ended up getting grilled himself. Another nodded. Comedy rarely loses on stage. Tonight, it did. MSNBC followed with its own take. Levit schools Rock with facts, crowd turns, comedian falters. Social media had seen it all. TikToks with split screens popped up within the hour. Chris screaming on one side, Karoline calmly delivering stats on the other. X, formerly Twitter, exploded with the hashtag #RockVs.Levitt. At first it was a fight, then it became a rout. One tweet read, Chris brought jokes, Karoline brought the receipts. Another posted a photo of Rock mid-rant, paired with Levitt standing still, captioned, "When you yell and still lose." Back in LA, Chris Rock went live. The lighting was harsh, the camera angle was too close. His face still flushed, his voice raspy but determined. Over 200,000 people tuned in within minutes. The number ticked upward like boiling water. 500K, 1 million, 1.5. He started yelling from the jump. Yo everybody, this ain't over. You saw what happened. That kid, Karoline Leavitt, thinks she can take me down on live TV? I'm Chris Rock. I've got 50 million followers. I don't lose to interns with bullet points. He paced, ranting like he was back on stage, pointing at the camera like it owed him an apology. She called me a clown? Please? I've made more people laugh in a week than she's met in her whole life. Melania is a prisoner. Everyone knows it. I don't need her White House PowerPoint to say what's real. But the energy was off. The chat flooded with split opinions. Some still loyal, others clearly not. Chris, you're spiraling. Bro, you lost, just log off. Karoline came with data, you came with ego. Still, he kept shouting. She said Melania did 50 charity events. She probably did them just to stay away from Trump at night. The feed ticked down. 1.5 million viewers, then 1.3, then 1.1. But Chris didn't notice, or didn't care. In Washington, Levitt sat in her office with a cup of tea and a quiet smile. Her team was already uploading her official post to X. It was simple, sharp, lethal. Chris Rock can yell loud, but truth doesn't need a mic, hashed facts over noise. It lit the internet on fire. The likes hit 50,000 in minutes. Memes followed, screenshots of Chris sweating mid-rant. Side-by-side photos, Rock screaming, Levitt smirking. One viral tweet said it all. Chris Rock starred in his own downfall, directed by Karoline Leavitt. Chris saw the post live, mid-stream. His face twisted. He froze, then exploded. She just posted that? Truth doesn't need a mic? I am the mic. I've been the mic for 30 years. But the viewership continued to fall. The comments were no longer with him. Man, she really broke you. You yelling into a void now. Go take a nap, legend. And just like that, he cut the stream. No goodbye, no closing line. Just a silent screen, leaving millions with one thought. Chris Rock had lost. Not just the argument, the room, the moment, the crowd. The live stream ended with a sudden flicker. No final words, no punchline, no redemption arc. Just darkness. Chris Rock's face vanished from millions of screens, replaced only by silence and a digital echo of what had just unfolded. People didn't log off because the stream was over. They left because the moment had slipped from his grasp, and everyone could feel it. Inside his Los Angeles apartment, the air was thick. The walls seemed to close in as Chris stood in the dark, the glow of his laptop the only light left. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. No script, no jokes, no audience. Just fallout. Tony, his longtime manager, watched from the corner of the room, eyes fixed on the plummeting stats. From a peak of 2 million viewers at the stream's height, down to 1.5, then 800,000 by the final seconds. A freefall. And Chris knew it. He slammed the table with an open palm, sending an empty coffee cup spinning. His voice was no longer loud, just hoarse. How the hell did this happen? He looked at Tony, his tone shifting from anger to disbelief. I've got 50 million followers, 50 million, and they picked her. Tony sighed, not in frustration but sympathy, the kind you give a friend who doesn't know they've just lost the biggest fight of their career. She didn't yell, he said softly. She had stats, you had shouts. Chris's eyes burned. He wasn't crying, not yet, but something behind them had cracked. "She called me a clown," he muttered. "Now everyone's laughing at me." Across the country, Karoline Leavitt wasn't laughing. She didn't need to. In a White House media room lit by soft overheads and the glow of a dozen screens, Karoline scrolled through her feed with clinical precision. Her team surrounded her, eyes darting between trending hashtags and comment threads. #Rockfest Levit had gone viral. But the tone had shifted. It wasn't just about the moment anymore. It was about the meaning. Chris brought jokes. Karoline brought justice. Levit didn't raise her voice once and still buried him. Chris Rock is funny, but tonight he was just sad. Her assistant walked in, tablet in hand, face glowing. "Karoline, your ex post is everywhere. 50,000 likes in under half an hour. MSNBC just quoted it on air." Karoline simply nodded. She didn't beam, she didn't gloat, she didn't need to. "He finished himself," she said. "We don't need to say anything more." The assistant nodded. "You won. CNN's calling you a silent hero. Fox says you crushed Rock with truth. You're across both sides of the aisle." Karoline folded her hands. Her voice stayed calm, controlled. "I'm not here for applause. I'm here to protect the president's family. Let him keep yelling. Truth doesn't shout, it stands still." Meanwhile, online, the memes exploded. Chris Rock, mid-rant, red-faced, fists clenched, captioned, "When you yell into the mic and still lose." Next to it, Karoline Leavitt, poised and silent. "When you don't even need a mic to win." On TikTok, edits went viral. Dramatic music swelling as Rock shouted into the void, suddenly cutting to Karoline calmly listing GDP stats like a judge delivering a sentence. One post read, "Chris brought a stand-up set. Karoline brought the receipts." Twitter threads analyzed the body language. YouTube pundits dropped reaction videos. Political commentators called it the most unexpected takedown in primetime TV history. Even comedians weighed in. Some defended Chris, others shook their heads. Hard to laugh when you're losing the room. And Chris? Chris sat in silence. The apartment that once felt like a fortress of fame now felt like a prison of regret. He stared at the cold coffee, still untouched from hours ago, while Tony stood beside him, not saying a word. "They were mine," Chris whispered. "The crowd, the world, they were mine." Tony gently sat beside him, his voice even softer than before. "You yelled too much, man," and she didn't flinch. She showed up with proof, with calm. That's what they needed. That's what they heard. Chris shook his head. "She had stats, I had truth." But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Tony gave him a long look. "She had truth too. That's why they listened." Chris didn't argue, didn't punch the table, didn't scream. He just stared into the quiet, as if looking for the moment where it all went wrong. Because somewhere between the punchlines and the panic, the king of comedy had walked into a room he couldn't control, and met someone who didn't need to laugh to win. The lights were off in Chris Rock's apartment. Not out of intention, out of exhaustion. The blue glow of his laptop still pulsed faintly across the room, casting long shadows across the once lively space. The table was littered with notes, a cracked phone case, and the now lukewarm remains of a cup of coffee that had gone untouched since before the livestream. He hadn't tweeted, he hadn't posted, he hadn't responded. Chris Rock, the man whose voice had once filled stadiums, echoed in living rooms, and reverberated through decades of comedy, had gone silent. On the news, the headlines told the story for him. Chris Rock retreats after viral showdown with White House press secretary. Levit triumphs. Facts over fame. Comedian falls flat in live meltdown. At CNN, a breaking chyron read, "Karoline Leavitt stands tall, Chris Rock absent post-clash." At MSNBC, a panel of analysts replayed clips from The Pulse, pausing on the moment Chris hurled his mic. "Look at that," one said. "That's not comedy, that's collapse." And online, the internet had made its decision. Chris Rock disappeared faster than his punchlines. He didn't just lose a debate, he lost himself. This wasn't a comedy set, it was a character arc. At the White House, Karoline Leavitt watched in silence. Her office was quiet. Her team had long since gone home, but she stayed behind. The screens still showed live feeds and trending metrics, but her focus wasn't on the noise anymore. Her assistant entered softly, holding a tablet with the latest numbers. "Your post just hit 100,000 likes." Karoline didn't look up. She just nodded, sipping her tea. "He's quiet now," the assistant added. "Not a word since the stream." Karoline finally looked up. Her eyes were calm, focused. Certain. He finished himself, just like I said he would. She stood, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, and walked toward the window. Outside, the White House lawn stretched into the night, silent and still, a mirror of her demeanor. "Prep a final statement," she said, voice crisp. "We don't need to mention him, just highlight what matters." The assistant was already typing. First Lady Melania Trump, 20 years of service, dignity, and grace. Chris Rock was noise. Truth stood taller, and still does. Karoline nodded slowly. That's all they need. Back on the airwaves, the narrative had locked in. Fox News called her a quiet warrior. CNN labeled her the press secretary who outclassed a legend. Even late-night hosts treaded carefully. One joked, Chris Rock faced off against the White House and got White Housed. Memes flooded the internet. Chris Rock with a red face and broken mic. When yelling doesn't save you. Karoline Leavitt sipping tea. Calm, chaos. A split screen circulated with the caption, "Volume doesn't equal victory." Even comedians were weighing in. Some defended Chris, saying he was provoked. Others admitted, Levit didn't beat him with emotion, she beat him with discipline. One well-known comic posted, "I respect Chris Rock, but sometimes the quietest one in the room has the sharpest knife." Chris Rock hadn't touched his phone. It sat there on the table, buzzing occasionally, muted now, as the world moved on without him. Tony stood at the edge of the room, arms folded. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say. Chris finally whispered, like someone confessing a secret. "I didn't lose. I just..." He trailed off. There was no ending to that sentence, because even he didn't believe it anymore. He slumped in the chair, not with defeat, but with a strange stillness, like a man who'd just realized the spotlight doesn't always protect you, that it can turn on you too. "I'm Chris Rock," he murmured again, but it wasn't a declaration now. It was a question. At the same time, Karoline Leavitt was preparing for her next day's briefing. She didn't mention Chris, didn't name him once, she didn't have to. The media had already written the epilogue, the internet had already built the statue. She was the woman who didn't raise her voice, and still won the war. As the assistant walked out of the office, Karoline turned back toward the window, her voice quiet, more to herself than anyone else. "He wanted a fight. Pause. But I brought facts." She sipped her tea and smiled. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. In a world where headlines are written by shouting and likes are earned through rage, Karoline Leavitt had taken down one of comedy's biggest names without raising her voice. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching, truth doesn't need a mic. The world didn't pause, it never does. But in the aftermath of the Chris Rock versus Karoline Leavitt showdown, something subtle but powerful had shifted. The viral clips were still circulating, the memes still multiplying. But now, the moment wasn't just trending, it was transforming. News tickers across every major outlet echoed the same story in different words. Leavitt triumphs, Rock retreats. CNN ran a special segment calling it a real-time unraveling. Fox News hailed Karoline as the calm voice that crushed chaos. And on social media, the verdict had long been passed and etched in pixels. The spotlight had moved, not toward Chris, but toward Karoline. In Los Angeles, Chris Rock had disappeared from view. No new posts, no public statements, no comedy bits. The stage that once lifted him now felt like a trap door. He stayed home, away from the camera, away from the heat, but not from the headlines. He sat at his desk, bathed in morning light that didn't feel warm, reading headlines that didn't read like victories. Chris Rock silenced after viral meltdown. Comedy meets consequence. The night Chris Rock got out-talked. The coffee from the night before was still there, now stone cold. His phone, face down. The silence wasn't strategic, it was survival. Tony, loyal as always, stood near the kitchen, scrolling through the damage. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. Chris finally broke the stillness. "I didn't lose," he said, again, but this time, the words didn't even sound like him. Tony looked at him, not with frustration, but with honesty. "You did, man, and the world saw it, but it's not the end." Chris didn't respond. He just sat there, staring through the window. No stage, no crowd, no mic. Just consequences. Back in D.C., Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium in the White House press briefing room, a place she knew, a place she commanded, the flash of cameras, the sea of reporters, the rhythm of questions and carefully measured responses. But today was different. Today, she didn't just stand there as a press secretary, she stood as the woman who had turned a viral brawl into a blueprint. Not by shouting, not by fighting dirty, but by holding her ground. Armed only with facts, poise, and a calm that couldn't be cracked. And the world had noticed. A Time magazine op-ed called her the new face of modern political strength. An MSNBC panel labeled her a generational communicator. Even TikTok teens were remixing her now iconic line, "You scream, I stand." She didn't chase the fame, but it found her anyway. She returned to her office after the briefing, unshaken, unbothered. Her assistant followed, tablet in hand. "Your closing statement's scheduled to post in an hour," the assistant said. Title, "Truth Always Wins." Subhead, "Chris Rock was noise, we were the signal." Karoline nodded. "Perfect. Post it. Then we're done." Across the internet, the story was no longer just a trending topic. It was a case study. Political blogs broke it down frame by frame. Communications experts analyzed it like chess. High school debate teams used it as a new gold standard. What happened on that stage wasn't just drama. It was a collision of worlds. Fame versus facts. Volume versus clarity. The past versus the now. Chris Rock brought the roar of history, the weight of fame, experience, and instinct. But Karoline Leavitt, she brought the future. Data, discipline, and a voice that didn't need to rise to be heard. By nightfall, the final wave of public opinion had crested. Chris Rock's name was still trending, but not for the reasons he was used to. Chris got outplayed, outclassed, and outposted. He tried to win the room, she won the world. Sometimes silence is louder than a punchline. And under all of it, quietly rising, was Karoline's closing post. In a world loud with opinions, truth still whispers louder. Melania Trump served with strength. We stood for her, and we still do. It didn't need jokes or fire or fanfare, just precision, grace, and power. So what's the lesson? It's not just that Karoline Leavitt won. It's not just that Chris Rock lost. It's that the world is changing. This showdown was more than entertainment. It was a reflection, a message. That truth, in the hands of someone steady and prepared, still carries weight in a culture that often rewards chaos. That facts, when wielded with confidence, still win. That yelling isn't power. Control is. So in a moment that felt like pure spectacle, the kind you scroll past at 2 a.m., the world got something rare. A reminder. That, in the age of noise, the sharpest weapon is calm truth. And the loudest victory is the one where you never have to raise your voice. The situation has been a wild ride, and it's clear that the controversy surrounding the Trump's marriage is far from over. Let me know what you think about this drama in the comments below, and don't forget to check out my other videos for more celebrity news and updates.